Have you ever looked at something and gone, there's no way that that'll eat me, and then suddenly you're being chomped in half by a baby hippo? Yeah, me too. These things happen all the time and it's crazy. And they also happen in mythology. So I've got 3 creatures here that you might be lucky enough to get eaten by on this Halloween Samhain festival tide. So grab a drink, grab a seat, let's get into it. Welcome back, wayward children, to my humble hovel. I am Castle, this is my tavern, and here we talk about myth and lore and tales of yore, specifically, and usually a set of stories handed down through my family through centuries of tradition. But today we are talking about things that people usually misunderstand when it comes to mythological creatures. These are going to be 3 things that I feel people either get mentioned wrong or they don't mention enough when it comes to terrifying things that'll eat you in mythology. And my number 3 pick is probably gonna get me flamed on Pinterest, but here we go. Let's get into it with my number 3, the Hedge Witch. Now many women online call themselves Hedge Witches, and I want to be very clear that they are not who I'm talking about here. No, the Hedge Witch is actually a very old creature in my family's mythology that's not often mentioned in academic Celtic or Gaelic mythology, and why so many witches online adopted that name, I will never know. But Hedge Witches we also call another name, and that is the Knot Troll. Knot Trolls are servants of Cernunnos and very often are responsible for not only eating children, but luring them into the woods so that Cernunnos may feed them to the roots of the trees, and they are a part of the changeling myth. And I've talked about changelings in a couple of videos before. Those will be linked in a playlist up above if you're interested in watching. Hedge witches are essentially wood trolls. They're sort of like dryads, but not as whimsical. They're scary creatures corrupted by the shadow of Cernunnos. Now, I've talked about this before as well. There are 2 aspects to Cernunnos. There are what we call the Void Horn, or the Shadow Horn, and Cernunnos himself, who is the Horned God. And there are a bunch of other names for these 2, and they spread throughout mythologies all over the world. You have mentions of horned gods in Celtic mythology, Gaelic mythology, Norse mythology, Slavic mythology, Japanese and Chinese myths. This man is prolific, to say the least. Now, Hedge Witches are sort of like the wild stepchild of Cernunnos, corrupted by the shadow or the shadowed horn god, and more or less they will just grab any creature that is nearby that is not animal, so basically humans, and they will drag them into the woods and eat out their liver and left kidney and leave them to fertilize the roots of the tree. And that is why Hedge Witches get way too much of a good rap and not enough flack for the number of children that they eat. I just know that Instagram is going to come for me. But here we go, moving on to my second pick. One that is wildly misunderstood, primarily because of D&D. And that is the Bugbear. Bugbears are a hobgoblin-like creature that look like moss-covered mounds. They primarily live on the edge of villages, and you may have guessed it already, but they are well known for eating children. Most specifically, and usually by luring them in with a sweet smell of honey, or in the modern day it might even be with a sweet smell of candy or sweet V-Bucks for Fortnite. That is a terrible dad joke. I'm going to get flamed for that. I'm very out of touch with what the youths are into these days. I spend most of my time in a tavern reading books. Bugbears are not particularly aggressive creatures. They are sort of like the Snorlax of the fairy world. They lay in rest and in waiting, and as soon as something gets close enough for them to grab with their ridiculously long arms. I haven't found any good depictions of this online, but the bugbear is essentially a hobgoblin or even a redcap, but they are short and stout, and they sort of lay face down, but their arms are like 4 times the length of their body. So if your average bugbear is about 3 to 4 feet tall, then their arms are usually about 10 to 20 feet long, and they look like long branches of trees because they're all brown from being buried in the soil all day. And as soon as something gets close enough for them to grab, they grab it, drag it underneath themselves, and they slowly eat away at it, never even bothering to get up. They just lay there and eat it. And that is why the bugbear is the second on this list of creatures that don't get enough attention for the sheer amount of child flesh that they consume. So let's move on to my number 1, which is the most terrifying creature on this list. And that is the Nuclevi. The Nuclevi is surprisingly underspoken about amongst all of the myth and lore channels and all of the fiction writers in existence. It gets very little attention for how and objectly terrifying it is just inherently. Now, this is a deep sea creature from Scottish folklore, but it has roots and grounds in Norse folklore as well, and gets some attention in myths alongside the Knock, which is of course still from Norse folklore, but it is also ranked amongst Kelpie and other horse-like spirits. But where this one is very unique is that it's a pure spirit of destruction. Its whole deal is to bring about decay. Now, well, it is still a misunderstood spirit, and its idea and its purpose was to bring about new life through decay. It wasn't always one that was brought about with favour, because that was all that it did. And the mirth of the sea was always intended to keep it locked away, but during the winter months when she joined the procession, it was up to the other sea gods to keep it locked up, and that didn't always happen, especially during conflicts. So gods like Manan MacLear and others were responsible for making sure that this thing just didn't run rampant throughout all of the world. And it was fortunate for them that it was consigned to seawater, because if it ever touched fresh water, its flesh, what little was left of it, would start to melt off and fall into the sea. But the breath of the Nuclevi would kill crops, cause sickness, and would cause the death and disease of livestock. This creature was well known for its horrifying appearance and the sheer plague that it carried with it. One might even call it one of the horsemen of the apocalypse, in the fact that it brought disease and pestilence with it wherever it went. What's less known about the Nuclevi is the sound that followed it. A subtle drum beat and a loud hum, rhythmic in the way that it played, much like a heartbeat and the gentle buzzing of a saw. And if it was ever heard, you knew that very soon sickness would befall you and those around you, and that if it was not taken care of soon, if you were not splashed with fresh water, then it was very possible that disease and plague would rot you and all around. Thank you for joining me for this story, my friends. I hope you have enjoyed. A like is always appreciated, and I will see you the next time you join me here in the tavern. Stay bloodthirsty, my friends, and remember, all hail the Black Dragons. Happy summer. I'll see you next time.